For centuries, humanity has asked the same question: how will it all end? Ancient scriptures spoke of a time when the world would begin to change, not all at once, but in signs. Subtle at first, almost unnoticeable.
What is that?
And then undeniable. Wars, disasters, fear spreading across nations. Many believed these were just stories, symbols, metaphors, warnings of a distant future. But what if they were never meant to be distant? What if the signs are already here? And what if this is only the beginning? And so it begins. Not with fire, not with destruction, but with something far more subtle, a shift. The scriptures spoke of a time when the world would not end suddenly, but would begin to change, quietly, almost invisibly. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that these would be only the beginning of sorrows, not the end, but the warning. At first, life would continue as normal. Cities would rise with the sun, people would walk their familiar paths, conversations would fill the air. And yet, something would feel different. Hard to explain, but impossible to ignore. A growing unease, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And those who were watching closely would begin to realize this was not random. This was not coincidence. This was the first sign that everything was about to change.
Why is everyone stopping?
Something's not right here.
Everyone just stopped.
The first sign was never meant to stand alone, because what followed was a pattern, not confined to one place, not limited to one moment, but spreading quietly across the world. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that these things would rise together like the beginning of a storm. Not yet destruction, but the warning of what was coming. And slowly, people began to notice, not all at once, but in fragments. A headline here, an event there, a feeling that something wasn't right. The oceans no longer calm, the skies no longer still, the world no longer predictable. And though many tried to explain it away, to call it coincidence, to call it normal, the pattern kept repeating, growing, expanding, connecting, until it became impossible to ignore. Because this was no longer a single sign. This was something greater, something written long ago, now beginning to unfold. And soon, the world would witness what happens when the signs begin to intensify. The second phase would not remain hidden. It would not pass quietly or unnoticed, because what was once subtle would begin to break through into the world. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that nation would rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, not as isolated events, but as something far greater, a shift in the balance of peace itself. And suddenly, the calm was gone. What once felt distant now felt close. What once felt rare now felt constant. The world was no longer steady. Fear began to spread, not in one place, but everywhere. And with every passing moment, the question grew louder: is this just history repeating itself? Or something far more intentional? Because if this was only the beginning, then what comes next would not just shake nations, it would shake the world itself. the signs were never meant to remain among nations alone, because as conflict rose, something else began to awaken: the earth itself. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that there would be famines and earthquakes in various places, not as isolated disasters, but as signals, responses, as if creation itself was reacting to something unseen. The skies no longer predictable, the seas no longer calm, the ground beneath no longer steady. And for the first time, it was no longer possible to ignore. Because this was not just human conflict, this was something deeper, something written long before this moment. And as the storms grew stronger and the earth grew louder, one truth became clear: the signs were intensifying. And what was coming next would not just be seen, it would be believed. Because as the world searched for answers, new voices began to rise. Not all at once, but gradually, across nations, across cities, across screens. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that many would come claiming to have the truth, and many would listen. At first, they sounded convincing, reassuring, even hopeful, promising clarity in a time of confusion. But beneath the surface, something felt off. Their words did not bring peace, only dependence, only division, only more questions. And yet, their influence continued to grow. Because in a world filled with fear, people will follow anything that sounds like certainty, even if it leads them away from the truth. And as these voices spread, one question remained: how do you recognize deception when it sounds so convincing? Because what was coming next would not just confuse the world, it would divide it. And as truth became harder to recognize, humanity itself began to change. Not in ways that could be measured, but in ways that could be felt. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that the love of many would grow cold. Not suddenly, but gradually, quietly, almost unnoticed. Compassion began to fade, patience began to disappear, and understanding became rare. People still lived side by side, but no longer truly saw each other. Conversations became shorter, reactions became quicker, and division became easier. What once held humanity together began to weaken, and in its place grew something else: distance, distrust, disconnection. And though many did not realize it, this change was not separate from the signs. It was part of them. Because before the world could fully break, the people within it had to change first. And as that change spread, the next phase was already approaching, one that would not just affect emotions, but survival itself. Because as humanity struggled to hold itself together, the world around them began to take even more. What was once abundant became uncertain. What was once routine became fragile. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that there would be famines in various places, not always sudden, not always extreme, but enough to change how people lived, how they thought, how they trusted. Daily life was no longer guaranteed, and slowly, survival became a question. Not for some, but for many. The smallest things began to matter more. Resources became limited, patience became thinner, and fear became closer. Because when people begin to feel that what they need might not be there tomorrow, everything changes. Decisions become harder, trust becomes weaker, and unity becomes fragile. And as this pressure grew, it revealed something deeper, not just about the world, but about people themselves. Because what comes next would not just test survival, it would test belief. Because when everything begins to fall apart, people begin to question what they truly believe, not just about the world, but about truth, about purpose, about what comes next. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that many would fall away, not because they were forced, but because doubt would begin to grow, quietly, deeply. In a world filled with noise, conflicting voices, and constant fear, certainty becomes difficult, and belief becomes fragile. Some would hold on, even when it was hard, even when it made no sense. But others would begin to let go, slowly, almost without realizing it. Because when the world changes, so do the questions people ask. And when those questions go unanswered, doubt begins to take their place. And yet, this moment, this struggle, was never outside the signs. It was part of them. Because before everything is revealed, humanity must decide what it truly believes. And as those choices begin to form, the next phase would make those choices impossible to ignore. Because the world was no longer moving together, it was beginning to divide. Not by borders, not by distance, but by belief, by perception, by the choices people began to make. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that many would turn against one another, not always with conflict, but with separation, a quiet, undeniable divide. What once felt united now felt fractured. People who once stood side by side began to walk in different directions, and the space between them continued to grow. Conversations became harder, understanding became rarer, and trust became uncertain. Because when belief is tested and truth feels unclear, people do not stand still. They choose, even if they don't realize it. And as those choices multiplied, the world began to separate into something new, something irreversible. Because once division begins, it does not easily return. And what was coming next would not just divide people, it would push them to their limits. Because the signs were no longer forming, they were accelerating. What once unfolded slowly began to happen all at once. In the Gospel of Matthew, it was written that these events would come like birth pains, increasing in frequency, in intensity, closer and closer together. And now that pattern could no longer be ignored. There was no time between one moment and the next, no space to recover or to understand. Because as one event ended, another began, faster than before, stronger than before, leaving behind only questions, only uncertainty, only the growing realization that this was not slowing down, it was building. And with every passing moment, the world moved closer to something inevitable, something unstoppable. Because once the signs begin to accelerate, there is no returning to what once was. And what comes next will not just affect the world, it will define it. Because as the signs intensified, a new kind of influence began to take hold. Not forced, not immediate, but accepted, welcomed by a world searching for stability. In times of uncertainty, people look for direction, for clarity, for something that feels certain. And slowly, that need began to shape the world itself. Voices that once competed now began to align. Messages that once differed now began to sound the same. And influence became something greater, something unified, something powerful. In the unfolding described within the book of Revelation, there would come a time when authority would rise not through force alone, but through acceptance, through trust, through the desire for order. And as that influence spread, it began to shape how people thought, how they acted, and how they chose. Because when the world feels unstable, control can feel like comfort, even when it comes at a cost. And what comes next will begin to reveal just how far that influence can reach. Because influence was only the beginning of something far more controlling. What once guided people now began to organize them, to structure their movements, their decisions, their access. In the unfolding described within the book of Revelation, there would come a time when the world would move not freely, but systematically. Order would replace uncertainty, structure would replace chaos. And for many, this would feel like relief. Because in a world that had grown unstable, control can feel like safety. But beneath that order, something else was forming, something quieter, but far more significant. Because structure does not just guide behavior, it shapes choices, limits movement, defines what is allowed and what is not. And slowly, the space for uncertainty began to disappear, replaced by something far more precise, far more controlled. And as this system spread across cities, across nations, one truth became harder to ignore. The world was no longer simply reacting, it was being shaped. And what comes next would reveal just how complete that control could become. Because control was never meant to remain external. It was always leading to something more personal. What once shaped systems now began to shape individuals, quietly, directly, without resistance. In the unfolding described within the book of Revelation, there would come a moment when participation would no longer be optional, not enforced with chaos, but integrated into daily life, into choices, into identity. And for many, it would not feel like control, it would feel normal. Because when something becomes part of routine, it is no longer questioned, only followed. And slowly, the line between decision and direction began to blur. What people chose began to feel guided, influenced, expected. And as that shift deepened, something critical began to emerge. Not just control, but identification. A way to define who belonged and who did not. And what comes next would make that distinction impossible to ignore. Because the system was no longer just guiding people, it was beginning to separate them. Not gradually, not quietly, but clearly. In the unfolding described within the book of Revelation, there would come a moment when distinction could no longer be avoided, when neutrality would no longer exist. People would no longer stand in between. They would be identified by their choices, by what they accepted and what they refused. And for the first time, the divide became visible, not just in thought, but in reality. Two paths moving in different directions, two outcomes forming side by side, and the space between them continued to grow. Because once separation is defined, it does not fade. It strengthens, it solidifies, until it becomes permanent. And as that line was drawn, the next phase would make the consequences impossible to avoid. Because the time for quiet decisions was coming to an end. What once felt distant, what once felt optional, now stood directly in front of everyone. In the unfolding described within the book of Revelation, there would come a moment when choice would no longer be hidden, no longer delayed, and no longer without consequence. Because every decision begins to define where it leads. And as the divide became clear, so did the outcomes. Not immediately, not always visibly, but inevitably. And for many, this moment would feel overwhelming, because uncertainty leaves room for hesitation, but clarity demands a response. To stand still was no longer an option. To wait was no longer possible. And as people began to choose, quietly, personally, irreversibly, the world itself began to reflect those choices. Because what comes next will not just reveal decisions, it will reveal their consequences. Because once choices are made, the outcome begins to unfold. Not always immediately, not always clearly, but inevitably. What was once uncertain now begins to take form. In the unfolding described within the book of Revelation, there would come a time when the results would no longer be hidden, when what was chosen would begin to appear in the world itself. And slowly, the difference became visible, not just in individuals, but in environments, in atmosphere, in direction, because every path leads somewhere. And now, those destinations were beginning to show. What once felt like a single world no longer looked the same. It had changed, divided, not just by choice, but by outcome. And as that difference grew clearer, so did the realization that this was only the beginning. Because what comes next will not just reveal outcomes, it will intensify them. Because the outcomes were not meant to remain small. They were always meant to grow. What had begun as subtle differences now became undeniable contrasts. In the unfolding described within the book of Revelation, the effects would not stay contained. They would expand, intensify, spread beyond their origin. And now, that expansion had begun. The lines that once separated now deepened. The conditions that once differed now widened. And the outcomes became harder to ignore. Because when something begins to unfold at this scale, it does not reverse, it advances. And as it advances, it pulls everything further into its path. What once felt distant now felt unavoidable. What once felt contained now felt everywhere. And as the intensity increased, one truth became clear. This was no longer a possibility, it was a progression. And what comes next will not just intensify the outcomes, it will begin to reveal the full extent of what has been set in motion. Because what had been unfolding was never meant to continue forever. It was always leading to a moment, a threshold, a point beyond which there would be no return. In the unfolding described within the book of Revelation, there comes a time when the progression becomes permanent, when what has been set in motion can no longer be reversed. And now, that moment had arrived. The movement had slowed, the choices had been made, the outcomes had taken form, and the divide had become fixed, no longer shifting, no longer uncertain, but established, final. Because once a system reaches this point, it does not retreat, it advances into its final stages. And as the world stood still in that realization, one truth became unavoidable. This was not the end, but the beginning of what comes next. And what comes next will not just affect the world, it will transform it. Because once the point of no return is crossed, the sequence begins, not as chaos, but as revelation. In the visions recorded within the book of Revelation, the opening of the first seal marked the beginning of a new phase, one that would not unfold in silence, but in meaning, in symbolism, in signs that could be seen and felt. And as the first seal opened, something appeared, not forced, not sudden, but revealed, a figure emerging from the distance, moving forward with purpose, with direction, representing not destruction, but conquest, influence, expansion. Because the beginning was not about the end, it was about what would rise first, a presence that would move across the world, quietly at first, but steadily, and those who witnessed it may not have understood immediately what it meant, but its movement would not go unnoticed. Because this was not an isolated moment. It was the opening
of a sequence already set in motion, and with the first seal revealed, the world stepped further into what had been written long ago.
The next sign did not wait long. As the second seal opened, the atmosphere shifted. What had once advanced quietly now began to disrupt. In the visions recorded within the book of Revelation, the second seal revealed a force not of influence, but of division, a removal of peace, not in one place, but across many. And with that absence, conflict began to rise, not always with warning, not always with reason, but with momentum. The balance that once held began to weaken. Tension that once lingered began to surface, and across the world, the sense of stability continued to fade. Because when peace is removed, even briefly, the effects are immediate. Relationships strain, trust fractures, and fear begins to take hold. What had already been set in motion now moved faster, with greater force. And as this second sign unfolded, it became clear that the sequence was not slowing, each step drawing the world deeper into its progression. And this progression was only gaining strength. Then came a shift, not of conflict, but of need. As the third seal opened, the world began to feel imbalance. In the visions recorded within the book of Revelation, this moment was marked not by noise, but by measure, by limitation, by the careful weighing of what remained. What was once abundant now required attention, precision, restraint. And as this change unfolded, it did not arrive with urgency, but with quiet pressure, the kind that builds slowly until it cannot be ignored. Daily life became more deliberate, every choice more calculated. Because when resources become uncertain, even the smallest decisions begin to matter. And as this imbalance spread, it revealed something deeper, not just about supply, but about dependence. Because when people begin to measure what they have, they also begin to realize what they lack. And that realization changes everything. The sequence continued, steady, precise, unfolding exactly as it was written. And then, the weight of it all became impossible to ignore. As the fourth seal opened, the sequence reached a deeper level. Not louder, not faster, but heavier. In the visions recorded within the book of Revelation, this moment carried a presence that moved across the world with quiet certainty. It was not sudden, it did not need to be, because everything before it had already prepared the way. What had begun with movement, then conflict, then scarcity, now reached a point where the effects could no longer be separated. They overlapped, they combined, they settled into the world itself. And as this presence moved forward, it left behind a silence, a stillness that carried more weight than noise ever could. Because when everything begins to converge, the result is not chaos, but realization. A moment where the world recognizes that what is happening is no longer distant. It is here, and it is unfolding, step by step, exactly as it was written. But this sequence was not only seen on the surface. There was more, unfolding beyond what the eye could perceive. As the fifth seal opened, the focus shifted, not to events, but to meaning. In the vision recorded within the book of Revelation, this moment revealed something deeper, a perspective beyond the visible world, beyond the movement, beyond the conflict, beyond the scarcity. It showed that what was unfolding was not without awareness, not without purpose, and not without witness. Because every moment that had taken place, every choice, every consequence was seen and remembered. And as this perspective was revealed, it brought with it a sense of pause, a moment to reflect,
To understand that the sequence unfolding was not random, it was part of something far greater. And as that realization settled, the next moment would return the focus back to the world, but with a force unlike anything seen before.
Then the stillness broke, and what followed could no longer be contained. As the sixth seal opened, the world itself seemed to respond. In the vision recorded within the book of Revelation, this moment was not subtle. It was unmistakable. The sky shifting, the atmosphere reacting, the world becoming aware all at once. What had been unfolding step by step now reached a level that demanded attention, not from a few, but from everyone. Because there are moments when something happens that no one can ignore. A moment where uncertainty fades and realization takes its place. And as people looked upward, as the world reacted, one truth began to settle deeply. This was not coincidence. This was not random. This was the continuation of what had already begun. And now it had reached a scale that touched everything and everyone. The sequence had advanced beyond quiet signs, beyond hidden meaning, into something undeniable, something visible, something real. And as that realization spread, the world stood on the edge of what would follow. And in that moment of awareness, everything paused. Not because it had ended, but because it was about to continue in a different way. In the vision recorded within the book of Revelation, there comes a moment of silence, a pause before what follows. Not empty, not meaningless, but intentional. Because after intensity, after movement, after realization, there is a space to reflect, to understand what has already unfolded and what it means. The world, having witnessed so much, now stood still, not in peace, but in awareness. Because silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is preparation, a moment where everything holds just before it moves again. And as that stillness settled, it carried a weight unlike anything before it. Not visible, but deeply felt. Because what follows a pause like this is never small. It is decisive, it is final in direction, and it moves with purpose. Then the silence gave way. What had paused now continued. Not slowly, not uncertainly, but with direction. In the vision recorded within the book of Revelation, the opening of the next phase marked a shift, a transition from preparation into action. What had been revealed, what had been understood, now began to move forward, with clarity, with intention. The stillness had served its purpose, and now motion returned. Not as chaos, but as continuation. Each moment building upon the last, each step unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Because this phase was never separate from what came before. It was the progression moving forward. And as it began, the world once again found itself within a sequence that could not be stopped, only experienced as it unfolded. The next movement carried a different weight, not faster, but deeper. What had already begun now settled more firmly into the world. In the vision recorded within the book of Revelation, this phase was not defined by speed, but by intensity, a steady increase that could be felt in every moment. The atmosphere grew heavier, the movement more deliberate, as if everything was being drawn toward a single direction,
a single outcome. Because when a sequence reaches this stage, it no longer expands outward, it narrows, focusing everything toward what lies ahead. And as that focus sharpened, the sense of inevitability became stronger, harder to ignore, harder to escape. The world no longer questioning, but recognizing that what was unfolding was reaching its final direction, and every moment moved closer to that point. Then, the shift became unmistakable. What had been building, what had been forming beneath the surface, now stood fully revealed. In the vision recorded within the book of Revelation, there comes a moment when everything becomes clear. Not gradually, not quietly, but all at once. The direction, the outcome, the meaning behind it all, no longer hidden, no longer uncertain. And as that clarity emerged, it carried with it a weight that could not be denied. Because when something is fully revealed, it demands recognition. It demands understanding. The world no longer searching for answers, now faced with them, directly, clearly, without distance. And in that moment, hesitation faded, uncertainty dissolved. What remained was awareness, a complete understanding that everything had been leading to this, and from this point forward, there would be no confusion about what was unfolding.
And as clarity settled, the final movement began to take form. What had once been uncertain now stood defined, not in fragments, not in stages, but as a complete picture. In the vision recorded within the book of Revelation, there comes a point where everything aligns, every moment, every choice, every outcome coming together, not randomly, but with purpose, with direction. And as that alignment took shape, the world no longer appeared divided by uncertainty, but by resolution. Each side fully formed, fully aware, fully positioned. Because when a sequence reaches this stage, it no longer builds, it prepares for completion. And as that preparation settled, one truth became undeniable. Nothing remained unfinished. Nothing remained unclear. Everything had led to this moment. And from here, only one step remained. And then, the conclusion. Not as an ending, but as a fulfillment. Everything that had unfolded, every moment, every sign, every choice, had led here. In the vision recorded within the book of Revelation, the final phase is not described as chaos, but as completion, a moment where what was set in motion reaches its purpose, where what was divided stands resolved, and what was uncertain becomes clear. The world, having passed through every stage, now stands still once more, not in tension, not in fear, but in understanding. Because the sequence was never without direction, it was always moving toward this moment, a moment of clarity, of realization, of completion. And in that stillness, one truth remains. What has been written has unfolded. What has unfolded has reached its purpose. And what remains is not uncertainty, but meaning.